Well, hello, and welcome to the first of what might be a few videos as we continue our study in the book of Ecclesiastes. And hopefully, we'll be able just to keep things moving during these different times. And that way, when we're back together, we'll just pick up right where we need to be. And I'm going to try and get these videos out every Wednesday midweek. It might be Thursdays sometimes, just depending on how the week's going. But at least for the next couple of 3 weeks, as we have to remain separate from one another, at least in person. And I hope everyone is doing well. Hope you're enjoying the beautiful weather we've had the last few days. We've been able to get out and do quite a few walks. I see lots of people out and about in the neighborhood, so we try and move far away from each other as we pass on the sidewalk and smile and wave. But and then our kids have rediscovered tennis, so they've been going up the last few days to the park near our house and playing tennis. So I guess there's some positives coming out of all of this, and we're just thankful for the beautiful spring weather. I know Friday it's sounding like winter is going to remind us that it's still around a little bit. Sounds like some kind of colder weather and a little bit of snow flurries here and there, but then next week's looking good again. So we'll just keep praying for the nice weather and thanking the Lord when we do get it. Well, I want to turn our attention once again to the book of Ecclesiastes. And we're still in the early stages here, chapter 1, verses 11 through 226. And what we've been looking at the last few weeks when we were together are these bubbles that Solomon is talking about. And in essence, what he's doing is he's popping the bubbles with his pen of insight. And these are the bubbles, in essence, that we create to insulate ourselves from the reality of death. We want to avoid that reality. We want to deny that reality, and that's what this book of Ecclesiastes, is all about. And it's this: accept the fact that you're going to die, because once I accept the fact that I'm going to die, once I embrace the reality of death, then I can determine how to live life. And that's why it's called the book that I'm basing this on, living life backwards, because I look to the end and I recognize nothing can change the fact that I'm going to die. And again, I realize as believers in the New Testament era, we qualify that and say, well, I may not die. I might be raptured. Either way, there's an ending point to my life, and God knows what that is. I don't know. God knows what the ending point to my life is, and nothing I can do can change that. And many of us, meaning humans in general, spend our lives trying to avoid that reality or numb ourselves to that reality or even try to change that reality. No, I'm not going to die. But we are. No one has yet figured out how to cheat death. There is only one man who has ever lived who defeated death. He didn't cheat death, he defeated death. And obviously that's Jesus Christ. And you might say, well, but there were others in the Bible who rose from the dead. Yes, but all of them eventually died still. And we have those miracles that Jesus did, and a few in the Old Testament, but eventually all of those individuals still died. Jesus is the only one who lives eternally, and we will live eternally as well, but our physical bodies will die. And so we build these bubbles around ourselves to insulate ourselves from that reality. We try to deny that reality and avoid that reality. I think of individuals right now who are very scared about the fact that the coronavirus could get them. And I mean, I'm not being foolish. We're trying to be careful. And I will tell you, I don't want to get this thing. I realize that, I think most people who get it they don't die from it, but it doesn't sound like a fun experience. And I don't want to get sick, period. And so we're wise about that. We're not foolish. But I see some people, on Facebook trying to like insulate themselves and only entertain themselves. And I'm avoiding all news and all information. I want to deny that reality. And so that's what Solomon's talking about in these verses. I apologize for that. Thought I had silenced my phone. And so one of the last ones that we looked at was the bubble of wisdom. And I'm just going to kind of do a quick review of that, and then we got into the bubble of pleasure as well. But Solomon was the wisest man who ever lived. We're told that in Scripture. We have proof of that. Literally, rulers and other people from all over the world at that time came to see him, to seek his wisdom. And so, but Solomon, his conclusion about wisdom was that in much wisdom is much grief. And that's found there in chapter 1, the end of chapter 1 in Ecclesiastes. Hopefully you have your Bible there with you. Whoops. Knocking things off my desk. It's not a lot of room here. But hopefully you have your Bible there, and you can see he said that in verse 13 that he applied his heart to seek and search out by wisdom all that is done under heaven. And he says it's an unhappy business. And then he says, I've seen everything that's done under the sun. It's vanity. It's striving after wind. He says in verse 16, I've acquired great wisdom, surpasses everyone before him. Verse 17, he applied his heart to know wisdom, and to know madness and folly. I perceive that this also is but a striving after wind. For in verse 18, for in much wisdom is much vexation, and he who increases knowledge increases sorrow. So his conclusion about wisdom is much knowledge is much sorrow. It's grief. Now, we established too when we talked about this, learning is a good thing. I mean, I hope it's a good thing. I've dedicated pretty much my whole life to learning. I was a student. I've been a student, and I've been a teacher for pretty much all of my adult life. So I hope I haven't wasted my time, and I don't think I have. Learning is a good thing when it's done through, one, a biblical worldview. And then it's also a good thing if my reason for learning is to take advantage of exploring God's world through the lens of his word, which is that biblical worldview. And so what Solomon here is saying is he's not telling us don't gain wisdom, don't gain knowledge, just get rid of all learning. He's saying, what's your reason? If you're trying to pursue wisdom and knowledge and learning so that you can either insulate yourself from the reality of death, or because you think somehow by learning all of these things you're going to be able to escape death or cheat death, then that's much vexation, that's much sorrow, because you can't. So learning is a good thing when it's done for the right reasons, which is to learn more about God and done through a biblical worldview, as well as to help others. I mean, there's nothing wrong with that motivation either. So then, and we had started talking about this back on March 15th, the last time we were all together, we have the bubble of pleasure. And we start that in chapter 2. In the ESV that I have, it's actually listed as the vanity of self-indulgence. And I think we could use either term, self-indulgence or pleasure. It's kind of that same idea. And so the idea here is much wisdom only led to much vexation and sorrow for Solomon, right? So now, Psalm's like, fine, I'm going to try and insulate myself from the reality of death within the bubble of pleasure or self-indulgence. And I mentioned this the last time we were together, so this is a repeat for those who heard this. Excuse me. But it's important to point out here that this was not a total abandonment to foolish or sensual living. Solomon did not take leave of his senses here. Forgive the illusion, but if you've ever seen Bug's Life, the Pixar movie, and it's been a long time, it's an older one now, but there's this one part where they're at this circus, things are going bad, and this fly says, he's talking like he's drunk, he's like, I only got 24 hours to live, and I'm not going to waste it here. that's that idea of abandonment. I'm just going to do whatever. That's not what Solomon was doing. This wasn't a frivolous throwing away of his life. Rather, he actually took a studied approach to pleasure. And I put it this way, and again, I hope I don't offend anyone by saying this, because maybe many of us are in this category right now. But Solomon was not just going out eating at McDonald's and seeing how many Big Macs he could put down. He wasn't gorging on Twinkies. He wasn't just binging on Netflix and watching whatever was on there, right? He was eating gourmet food. He in gourmet restaurants with the finest drinks and the finest desserts. He was enjoying the highest quality of entertainment possible. So that's what I mean by a studied approach rather than just total sinful living. Now, I am not saying what he was doing was righteous. There was a whole lot of sin going on in here, but he wasn't just I want to make sure I'm clear on this. This wasn't just, I'm going to see how sinful I can possibly be. And I think I said this when we were together last, but again, it's been a couple weeks, so forgive me if I did, if this is repeat. This isn't the rebellious kid who says, I'm going to see how bad I can be. And I'm growing up in the church and in a Christian school. I knew some guys who were like that as soon as they got out from underneath their parents' thumb, it was like, I'm going to see how wicked and sinful I can be. And it wasn't, there wasn't really intention behind what they were doing other than to sin. And I mean, prodigal son kind of thing. If you think about the prodigal son, the description of him was he wasted his money on riotous living. That's that just total sinful living, and that's not what Solomon was doing. Solomon was pursuing complete and total living for self-indulgence, but it was a careful and studied approach. Now, I'm not justifying what Solomon did. Don't misunderstand me here. But this wasn't just being an idiot. This wasn't being a fool. And I think it's important to know that, because actually it's more important that we understand that, because it's easy to dismiss those who are just doing sinful living. It's easy to dismiss the prodigal son and say, well, sure, I see what's wrong with what he did. But sometimes I think in a little ways, and I'm going to say more about this in a minute, we almost might admire guys like Solomon because he's cultured, he's refined, but it was still self-indulgence, and he's trying to numb himself to the reality of death. And so whatever Solomon wanted to do, or simply wanted, he pursued it and acquired it. And he mentions this, wine, merriment, gardening, building projects, possessions, music, sex. I mean, whatever he wanted, he went after it. And he got it. Because he was the king, and he was the wisest man, and he was very wealthy. A couple of the things that he specifically mentioned are laughter and mirth. If you look at chapter 2, verse 1, he says, I said in my heart, come now, I will test you with pleasure. Enjoy yourself. But behold, this also was vanity. I said of laughter, it is mad. And of pleasure, or mirth is another translation of that. I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure or mirth, what use is it? And then he goes on to talk, he searched to cheer his body with wine, and that's where, verse 3, again, we know this is a studied approach, because he says, my heart still guiding me with wisdom. So he's making sure that we understand that. So let's talk about laughter and mirth for a minute. Wasn't anything wrong with laughing? It's the best medicine, right? Turn to Proverbs chapter 17. So that's going to be back to your left. Proverbs 17, verse 22. Proverbs 17:22. A joyful heart is good medicine, but a crushed spirit dries up the bones. By the way, I know some people who I think have crushed spirits, and it does seem as if their bones are dry, but that's another topic for another time. But a joyful heart is good medicine. Laughter is the best medicine, right? The Bible definitely speaks, and many other passages or verses that we could go to about this. The Bible definitely speaks to the value of a cheerful heart. So yes, there is no. I love to laugh. I mean, my family will tell you I love to be. I like watching things that make me laugh. I love to tell jokes and funny stories. I love to laugh. But this is not the same thing as what Proverbs is talking about here. Now, it's the same Hebrew word, but as with English, you got to look at context. So here's what Solomon is talking about here. This laughter, it can mean a couple of things. It's a superficial gaiety as a whole. It's used for the fun of a game. So we're playing a game, and we've been playing more games lately. Maybe you have at your house too. And that's fun. We enjoy that time of playing that game, but then it's gone. It's superficial. That thrill doesn't last. And so it's a passing fun, and it's happiness or laughter that is fleeting and passing. There's nothing wrong with it. It's not sinful. It's just not long lasting. And I think of, for me, that an illustration I thought of with this, a word or a picture, an image is a small child with bubbles. You dip the stick in and you blow the bubbles, and the little kids, they love to chase them around, but those bubbles, they can't grab them, right? As soon as they touch them, they pop, or they land on the ground and they pop, and it's fun for a while, and they love to chase them around, but you can't hold those bubbles. You can't keep those bubbles. Or cotton candy. By the way, I really don't like cotton candy, and dentists really don't like cotton candy. It's pure sugar, but it's sweet, and it's almost kind of fun to see it wispy and eat it. But boy, as soon as it hits your mouth, it's gone. And so that's this idea. Now, this can also be mocking or scornful laughter, laughing at another person's expense. That's also how this word can be used. And I don't know, maybe Solomon meant both. Maybe he laughed at some people's expense, or maybe he only means that fleeting laughter. Well, what about mirth? Or in the ESV, it's translated as pleasure. It's thoughtful pleasure. Now, again, this was not just frivolous or ridiculous living or fun. Solomon gave careful study on how to maximize his happiness, but it still did not provide a permanent escape from the reality of death. And so at the risk of sounding like a broken record, I want to point out laughter and merriment, or laughter and mirth or pleasure, those are wonderful gifts, and they can be actually powerful tools that we can use for the good of the gospel when they are rooted in a love for and control by the Lord. And so there's obviously all kinds of other scripture that tell us how we should be using laughter. It shouldn't be crude or crass or sexual innuendos or things like that. We shouldn't be using that kind of language, or trying to, tell the off-color jokes, or laughing at another's expense or anything like that. But laughter can be actually a powerful tool. I've talked before about the camp where Debbie and I work, the Wilds of the Rockies. The main one is in North Carolina. Our kids have gone there for years. And the Wilds has a wonderful philosophy. And they start the week talking about the rules. They have a big meeting with all the campers, and they have fun and skits in there. But Wednesday night is their big time with skits and everything, and they simply call it fun time. And I mean, it's hilarious. We would drive up when our kids were at camp there when we lived in Greenville, because it's just a little over an hour away. We would drive up on Wednesday midweek, see the kids, and we made sure to go to fun time. Even when our kids were in the junior camp, we went to the high school fun time because it was hilarious. And the reason they do that is to build bridges with campers. And they have this philosophy about breaking barriers and building bridges. And it's interesting to see. And when I worked there, I would say every week there were kids who spiritually would start to turn the corner on Wednesday night after fun time. They would start opening up more because they may be walking in thinking, oh, these spiritual people are stiff and they don't have any fun. And they get there and they're having a lot of fun. And then they see these guys who are preaching to them the Word of God and very serious about the Word of God, but also being willing to have bananas smashed in their eyes and just all kinds of goofy stuff. And so we can use fun. When we were at another church here in Lincoln, when we lived here before, our family started doing this, and we did it every year that we were there. And we did a fun night every year, kind of February, March time frame. And we had a different theme each year, and I put together all the skits, and I'd get the people there, and we tried to make it an evangelistic outreach. We would encourage people. It was a time of encouragement for our church family. People came and laughed and had a great time. We had a meal or desserts. And then other times, or we would always encourage people, invite friends. And because then we would always, the pastor would always give a brief challenge at the end. And it was a great time because someone might not want to come sit through a Sunday morning service, but for a skit night and food, sure, I'll come. We had fun. Oh, we had a lot of fun. I'd love to do that kind of thing again. But anyway, and I think Jesus had fun. I think Jesus laughed. He attended parties. He attended dinners and things like that. So I want to make sure, don't hear me saying that we should walk around somber. Sober, yes. Sober's different than somber. Sober means appropriate for the occasion. Somber means the long drawn faces of the Pharisees. Don't hear me saying we should be somber. But we also should be looking at laughter and gaiety and pleasure in the right way. They were given to us by God as tools to be used to glorify Him and to do good for others, encouraging them and uplifting them, and also building bridges, I think, for the gospel. But we can't look at it and say, I'm going to numb myself to the reality of life and pretend that death isn't coming by having this big party. I think of the story. I'm not going to say I'm a fan of Edgar Allan Poe because he was a very dark author, wrote in the Gothic style back in the 1800s. And he wrote very dark stories, but they really, I'm going to go on and say all of them that I can think of have a moral component to it. So he is worth, as Christians, I believe, reading, even though it was dark. You don't want to have a full diet of Edgar Allan Poe because he can take you to dark places, but he had morals in there. One of the stories he wrote, it's a short story, and I don't know if you may have read, it's called The Mask of the Red Death. And in that story, it's set in Europe during kind of the time of the plague, and this plague going on is the Red Death. And the very short version is this rich baron or lord of this castle. He decides that he and all of his wealthy friends are going to ignore the death from the plague that's going on outside among all the poor people. And so they lock themselves in the castle, and he decides to get their minds off of the death that's going on, and plus that they're wealthy and they're untouched and they won't be touched. He and all of his wealthy friends who are locked inside the castle and keeping the poor riffraff out who are dying of the plague, they're going to have this big masquerade ball where they wear masks. And you can probably figure out what happens. There's this mysterious figure and stranger throughout the party dressed all in red with a red mask. And pretty soon everyone in the castle starts dying. And finally this lord or baron, whatever he is the last one. And the point is that the red figure represented death, the plague. They had this big party, but they couldn't keep out death. No matter how much they played and tried to ignore that, death was there. And so that's kind of this mindset that Solomon is giving us. So quickly, I want to move on because I want to wrap up this part, and I'm going a little bit longer than I had intended to. But so beyond the laughter and mirth, there's also works of beauty. is how I'm labeling that Solomon. This is still under self-indulgence, but it's almost as if Solomon was anticipating an objection here. Well, sure, sensual living doesn't bring lasting meaning, but what about creating works of art? I mean, that's value right there. And so, but I want you to keep in mind that in this section, Solomon is still living a life of self-indulgence. Look at chapter 2. And in verse 4, he says, I made great works. I built houses and planted vineyards for myself. I made myself gardens and parks, and I planted in them all kinds of fruit trees. I made myself pools from which to water the forest of growing trees. And then he talks about buying male and female slaves, and slaves that are born in his house, and all these possessions. So Solomon is still living a life of self-indulgence here. Now he is engaging in works of beauty, is how I'm putting it. But he's not being altruistic here. He's not creating public gardens for everyone, because he goes through and he says, I made, I built for myself. I made myself. I made myself. And I think this is an important point to make here, and for us to realize all of the pleasures of this life, when they are pursued for oneself, for the sake of insulating yourself from the reality of death, and without a biblical worldview, they are meaningless and empty. They're still a breath, and they're gone. The merest of breath, and they're gone. And so that's the important point to drive home here. Pleasures are not bad. There's nothing wrong with laughing. There's nothing wrong with planting a beautiful garden, or creating a pool, or creating a work of art. God gave us those abilities. But why? Why are you doing it? And I think it's important to point out that too, because I think often we as Christians, we tend to rank things as being not as bad or even good, even if they're being pursued for self. Think about these two scenarios. If a young person misses church to play video games, what do we think of that young person or their parents for letting them do that? Okay? Well, what if they miss church to participate in an elite athletic event that could help lead to college scholarships? Or what about this? If a young person misses church to work a minimum wage job, what do we think of him or her or their parents? But what if they miss church because they're studying hard for some big tests in the coming week, and those big tests, if they do well on them, could lead to an opportunity to attend an elite college? I mean, think about those for a minute. Now, we know the obvious answer. Well, they shouldn't be missing church at all. And again, I want to point out here, don't hear me saying that if you miss church, you're a wicked, ungodly heathen who's going to hell. That's not what I'm saying. There times arise and something your child may be in conflicts with church on a rare occasion. I get concerned when people are missing church every week, and to my knowledge, we don't have anyone in our church doing that. So this is not, I'm not pointing this towards anyone. Things come up and things happen, and every now and then you got to work and stuff like that. Okay, don't hear me saying the occasion. I'm just using these as an examples because I think sometimes we tend to say, well, this is okay. Well, that kid, he's sitting down there in the basement playing video games and he's wasting his life. That guy over there, he plays on an elite athletic team. I really don't care what you're doing. My question is, why are you doing it? Because I can't look at what you're doing and say that's bad and that's good, or that's bad and that's good. Why are you engaging in this? And that's the point I'm driving home. We tend to rank these things. I would think if you're reading through Ecclesiastes here, you would say, oh, he made pools and gardens. That's great. This pleasure and mirth and wine and excess wine, that's bad. Over here, this stuff's good. But he says it's the same. Solomon's conclusion, what is it? It's mad. It's mad. In that idea of that means to shine forth briefly and then it's gone, or to be clamorously foolish. He also says, what use is it? Because he said back in verse 2, I said of laughter, it is mad, and of pleasure, what use is it? Another way of translating that is, what does it accomplish? And then he goes on, and we could, for sake of time, I'm not going to talk about the possessions and everything else he has, but, for chapters or verses 9 through 11 there. And in verse 9, he says, "Then I considered all that my hands had done, and the toil I had expended in doing it, and behold, all was vanity and a striving after wind, and there was nothing to be gained under the sun." The conclusion is the same. So what use is all this? What does it accomplish? Well, of course, the answer is, if we're asking if these things will distract us from the certainty of death and somehow insulate us from facing the difficulties of life under the sun, the resounding answer is, of course, no, they don't. So self-indulgence is worthless. Now, again, I want to make sure as I close, I want to make sure that I close with this. Laughter, pleasure, doing beautiful works, as Solomon talks about, even acquiring possessions in and of themselves, those are not sinful things. Don't hear me saying that. We should enjoy the world that God has given us to its fullest. He created the world and said it is very good, and he put Adam and Eve in the garden. Now, the world has been corrupted by sin, but that doesn't mean that to enjoy the world is sinful. It means, what's our reason for doing it? Why are we doing these things? And so we can take what God has given us and we can use it for his glory. We can use it to build bridges with friends and family and neighbors and coworkers who are unsaved. We can sit there and enjoy to the fullest that wonderful cup of coffee because it tastes good. And we can engage in a wonderful conversation. I realize, not right now. You know what I mean. We can engage in that. We can make a beautiful and delicious tasting meal and share it with unsaved people and unsaved family and unsaved friends. And we can laugh and we can do skit nights and things like that. There's nothing wrong with those things if we are doing them for the glory and honor of God, and to build bridges and to glorify God in this world, and not try to insulate ourselves from the reality that all of us have an end date. But once we accept that, then these things become that much sweeter as we seek to live our lives under the sun for God's glory. So I'm praying for you, and I look forward to opening the Word again on Sunday morning.